Hello and welcome back to my channel and welcome back to the Bible Study With Me series we're doing through the book of Esther. Today we're going to be in Esther chapter 6, and you guys, this chapter is so good. This is kind of like that turning point in the story, and there's so many ironic twists that happen here. So make sure you go back and watch the videos we already did on chapters 1 through 5 if you haven't already, so you can understand just the craziness of what's going to happen in this chapter. But a little refresher just to get us caught up to speed. Esther is a historical narrative set in the city of Susa, which is the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. And it tells the story of a Jewish community who is living in this city. And so these are among the people who did not return to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. And specifically, this is the story of a Jewish maiden from within those people who God uses to save her people. And as we've been saying all throughout this study series, God's name is actually not in this book, but his hand certainly is. This is a masterfully written story, as we're going to see even more in chapter 6, that could only be orchestrated by him. I'm going to read also the theme statement on this book from the Bible Project. It says that God's seeming absence does not mean he has abandoned his people. He uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people living in a messy world to accomplish his purposes and fulfill his promises. The book of Esther asks us to trust God even when we can't see him working, and to hold to the confident hope that no matter how bad things get, God is actively working to redeem his world. Again, that's from the Bible Project overview of the book of Esther. That, along with all the other resources I used for this study and the Bible study tools, those are all linked down below if you want to check them out. And now let's kind of recap the story so far. So in chapter 1, we have King Ahasuerus, who is the king of this Persian Empire. He holds this lavish 6-month party and basically asks his wife, Queen Vashti, to parade herself in front of his drunken friends. She refuses. She's kicked out of the role of queen. The king holds this beauty contest to choose a new queen, and Esther, the Jewish maiden, is chosen. And we've got this other guy, Haman, who is one of the king's officials, who gets promoted, but he's mad because Mordecai, who is the cousin of Esther, won't bow down to him. And so Haman devises this plot to kill the Jews, and then he casts lots to determine when this plan is going to go into place, which is going to be 11 months from this point in the story. And so Mordecai, upon learning of this plan, urges Esther, who is now the queen, to go into the king to plead for her people, but she could be killed for going into the king's courts without being summoned. And so after talking to Mordecai, there's that famous line of, "Who knows if you have been created for such a time as this?" She decides to act anyways, and she holds a fast to prepare for this risky act of going in to talk to the king. And so then in chapter 5, Esther goes in to the king. She risks her life to do this, and he grants her to come in, and instead of immediately revealing to him her ultimate request, which is to save her people, she first asks for a banquet with the king and then also with Haman. And then this first banquet happens, and then she requests another one. And we talked in last week's video, in the chapter 5 video, about why potentially she was asking for these banquets rather than immediately revealing her request. But that is where chapter 5 ends, with Haman going home to his wife and friends after that first feast and recounting all of his splendors, including being invited to these banquets by Queen Esther. But as he is going home, he passes Mordecai, and he's just enraged that even with all of these accolades, they meant nothing to him because this one man still will not praise him. And so he develops this plan with his wife and his friends to essentially go in the morning to request before the king to have Mordecai hanged on these gallows that he then builds. And so that is where chapter 5 ends, and that leads us directly into what we're studying today in chapter 6. Esther chapter 6 only has one subheading, and I just like to read these so we can kind of get an overview of what's going to happen in the chapter. But the subheading is the king honors Mordecai. So there's a little taste of what's to come. And this chapter is 14 verses. So that covers verses 1 through 14. And so as always, we're going to read through this entire chapter without stopping, then walk back through it a second time to unpack it and kind of pull out those biblical principles that it's teaching to us. And then as a reminder, we're going to go through a whole big list of those, at least from this study, of things that we can learn from the book of Esther. And so that's something to look forward to, but we'll go ahead and get into it. If you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel, and then also give this video a thumbs up if you have been enjoying this study series. So if you have a Bible, go ahead and pull it out and turn with me to Esther chapter 6. Verse 1, "On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, 'What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?' The king's young men who attended him said, 'Nothing has been done for him.' And the king said, 'Who is in the court?' Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, 'Haman is there, standing in the court.' And the king said, 'Let him come in.' So Haman came in, and the king said to him, 'What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?' And Haman said to himself, 'Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?' And Haman said to the king, 'For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.' Then the king said to Haman, 'Hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned.' So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.' Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, 'If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him.' While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared." All right, so let's go ahead and unpack chapter 6. So it opens by telling us that on this night after the very first banquet with Queen Esther and Haman, that the king couldn't sleep. And so he gave orders to have the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, brought to him and read before him. And as this was being read to him, it was found that it was written that there was this point where Mordecai had basically told him about these two people, Bigthana and Teresh, who were trying to kill the king. So if you remember, this happened back in chapter 2. And I just want to give us a reminder here that 5 years have passed since this actually happened. And we talked about this in the chapter 2 video, how Mordecai did this thing, this honorable thing, to essentially save the king's life, but nothing was done to recognize him. But as we pointed out in chapter 2, the story wasn't over yet. And now that little detail is coming full circle. And so we've got so many kind of seemingly coincidental things here, like we have throughout this entire book. So it just so happened that the king couldn't sleep on this particular night. And then it just so happened that he had them bring that exact book. and it just so happened to be opened to that exact page where it recounted this deed that Mordecai had done that was recorded back in chapter 2. And remember, this was the night after the first banquet with Queen Esther. The very next morning, as we learned in chapter 5, Haman was planning to ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared. And then the second banquet was going to be that next day. And so this is literally that exact time in between these very crucial events. And this just goes to show that God's timing is so precise for all of these things to just so happen to set into motion what we're about to see. A note from the Enduring Word commentary says that this book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, is essentially a book of remembrance, things that have happened throughout the kingship, throughout his reign, things for him to remember. And remember is what happens. Remember is what he does when he reads them. And a note I have here in my journaling Bible that I wrote one of the previous times I read through this book. I'm just going to go ahead and read it to you. It says that God is in the little details. He uses the little desires of our hearts that prompt us to make little decisions to move forward his big purposes. Perhaps our frustrations or roadblocks are at times meant to lead us somewhere. And so I just thought this was interesting because the king is experiencing insomnia. He can't sleep. And if you've ever not been able to sleep, you know that it's super frustrating. And all you want to do is figure out how to fall asleep. But it was that very insomnia, that very ability to not sleep, that frustration that God was strategically using to lead the king to a very particular place. And that was to the discovery in this book of remembrance. And so the king remembers and reads about what Mordecai has done for him. And then he says, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the young men who attended him said, nothing. We never recognized him. And a note from the Enduring Word commentary says that this is a rare moment of concern that the king expresses for a common subject. So he was concerned that Mordecai never got recognized or rewarded. And this is kind of rare, again, for the character development that we've seen in King Ahasuerus, that he wants to make sure this person is rewarded. And so he now at this point is considering a reward for Mordecai. And the rarity of him showing this concern, again, for a common person, also speaks to God's hand being in this. And so again, so many little details had to line up just so for all of this to happen. And so we've got the king trying to brainstorm how to honor Mordecai. And we don't know if this is still like the middle of the night when he can't sleep. I would think that maybe it is morning, because as he's trying to brainstorm how to honor Mordecai, in that exact moment, Haman walks into the court with his request, which the king doesn't know this, but we as the reader know that his request is going to be to have Mordecai hanged. And so the king sees somebody in the court, is like, who is that? His men tell him that's Haman. And so the king says, bring him in, and basically invites Haman to help him brainstorm how to honor Mordecai. Now, Haman doesn't know who they're honoring, who he's trying to help the king brainstorm who to honor. But I just think it's so ironic that literally, this is something I'd never really caught in the story before. Haman is walking into the king's courts to plot Mordecai's death, but instead he unwittingly takes part in planning his promotion, planning his celebration, planning this thing that is going to honor Mordecai. Like, how crazy is that? A note on this from the Enduring Word commentary says that if the book of Esther shows us anything, it shows us that God manages the affairs of men even without their knowledge. They didn't all know what they were walking into or what was going on in each other's minds, but God was orchestrating it even without them knowing all those details. God knows what he is doing. This is what the note says. And in the courts of heaven, there are no coincidences or surprises. So the king says to Haman, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman's thought to himself is, who other than me would the king seek to honor? And that just speaks to his pride of, who other than me would it be? That's where his mind goes. And a note on this, again from the Enduring Word commentary, says that God often allows fallen man to set his own trap, allowing Haman to make his pride and arrogance be the cause of his ultimate humiliation. And so Haman is thinking to himself, the king wants to honor me, and so he thinks he's planning his own sort of parade of honor, and so he includes all the details that he would have wanted. He asks for royal robes that have been worn by the king, a horse the king has ridden, a royal crown, and then the king's most noble official to dress him and lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." A note on this from the Enduring Word commentary says that he asks for things that mattered very little except to puff him up with pride. Haman was a tragic man who can only believe he has done well when he hears applause. It is good and sometimes appropriate to have applause here on earth, but it is tragic to live your life seeking for it. We should instead seek to be satisfied with the applause from heaven. And I think it's really easy to read about Haman and just kind of be like, man, he's just so prideful and he just, has this need for applause. But as I was kind of reading through that note from the Enduring Word commentary saying, it is tragic to live your life seeking for the applause of people, I had to ask myself the question, where do I see this aspect of Haman in my own life? Where do I see myself seeking after that applause? And so I think that's kind of just a good question to ask ourselves in this, like where do we see Haman in our own hearts? And so Haman is listing off all of these things to honor this person who he thinks is going to be him. And then we hit verse 10, and this is where we have a plot twist. So the king basically says, great, now please go do all those things for Mordecai. And I just try to imagine what would Haman's face have looked like in this moment. He probably would have been shook. He thought this was going to be all about him. And now the king is telling him to go do all of this for his number one enemy. And so Haman not only had to see someone else get the very thing that he wanted, this glory and this honor and these accolades, but he had to take part in giving it. He was going to be that noble official who was leading Mordecai throughout the city. And not only was it somebody else who was getting what he wanted, it was the very someone else who he hated the most. To top it all off, the king says, leave out nothing that you have mentioned. No ounce of glory is to be held back, lavish it all on Mordecai. And Haman, you get to be the one to do that. And part of the humiliation of doing this is he had to publicly honor the person who he hated most. He, again, had to be the one to parade him around. And so after this happens, we get to verse 12, and it says that Mordecai returned to the king's gate. And I kind of just wonder, what was he thinking? Because you get the impression that Mordecai really wouldn't have cared about all of this glory and these accolades in the way that Haman would have. But he also maybe would have found some satisfaction in the fact that Haman, this man who is trying to kill him and his entire people group, is now having to kind of parade him around. And so the Bible doesn't say anything about what Mordecai was thinking, but you just kind of wonder. But it says that Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried back home, and he was mourning and with his head covered. And so just this picture of shame. And the Enduring Word commentary says also that this is what you would do if someone near to you died, this mourning and this head covering. And the irony is that it's actually his pride that was dealt a death blow in all of this. And I want to read a note from my study Bible also on verses 12 and 13. It says, now it is Haman's turn to do as his intended victims had done when the decree of destruction was first published. And so Haman here now is mourning because essentially his enemy has some sort of victory over him, some sort of glory over him. And so Haman is mourning, and it is saying now it is his turn to do what all of his intended victims were doing after he decreed this intent to kill them. So he had put out this thing saying all the Jews are going to be destroyed. And we see that back in, the end of chapter 3 and the beginning of chapter 4, that the Jews are thrown into confusion and mourning and lamenting and wearing sackcloth and ashes. And so I just think that's another ironic point right here, that the people who he set out to kill and destroy just a couple chapters back were mourning, and now he is the one who is mourning. And again, the irony of that is the Jews were mourning because they were going to be destroyed. They were going to be killed. And Haman now is mourning because he is humiliated. He feels shame, again, because this person who he is seeking to destroy is now being elevated, and he is the one who has to take part in that. So Haman hurries home and he tells his wife Zeresh and his friends what had happened to him, and they essentially respond and say, basically, this isn't looking good for you. They say, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. And so just one chapter ago, probably hours ago in terms of the storyline, they were saying like, yeah, build this gallows, have Mordecai hanged on it. And now they're telling Haman, look, you're not going to beat this Mordecai guy. If he is a Jew, then you are actually going to fall before him. And so there's so much happening here, so many twists and turns and shifts that are happening all in such a short period of time. And literally while they are still talking, while Haman is still talking to his wife and his friends, the king's eunuchs actually came to take Haman away to the second banquet that Esther had prepared. And this literally feels like that TV episode that ends and you're just shook and you're like, what just happened? Like, it's such a twist that you didn't see coming and you're mind blown. And so that is how chapter 6 ends, and it's going to lead us into seeing what happens in chapter 7. And so that is going to be all for this video, all for this study. We're not going to do a further study section in the study journal, but again, I encourage you to just be praying through and processing through this, asking those questions of where do I see Haman in my own heart, and just anything else that may have come up for you through this study. And if you have anything like that, anything you're thinking through, whether it's something you learned or something that this chapter caused you to reflect on, leave a comment down below so we can all kind of glean from that and be reading through it. And if you've been following along with this study in real time so far, include a gold star emoji in your comment because that's always fun to see. Or if you found this video maybe a year from when it was posted or 2 years or whatever, comment that too, because it's also fun to see how God's word is unchanging, and what speaks to us now is also going to speak to us a year from now, just as it did 10 years ago. And so I hope that you have been enjoying this study and that you've been learning a lot. I know that I certainly have. Again, if you have a friend who you think would want to go through it as well, please feel free to share it with them. Thank you so much for being here. I love getting to do these studies with you. Thank you for watching, and I will see you back here next week for Esther chapter 7. Bye.